Hello, everyone, and welcome to the A Show, that being an E with an acute accent. This is Parker J. Bovée, and today it's more of a timely topic, one I've been meaning to get to, but one that comes in the light of really recent extreme flooding in New York City. Also, kind of backtracking a little bit more, pretty extreme flooding in California, which is perhaps not abnormal in the sense of natural conditions, but in the grander scheme of environmental engineering and feats of pretty impressive, what would the term be, hydrological engineering and civic engineering, I guess. Or civil engineering, rather. Civic engineering is a funny one. We should talk to some election lawyers about that. But civil engineering, with the construction of, especially over the last 200 years or so, more emphasis on the last 100 years, construction of dams and levees and ways to kind of maneuver and engineer and manipulate water in America, that really come into pretty severe tension, especially in the West, where a lot of the structures are a bit more sensitive to environmental manipulation. And it's a different way to kind of understand America, but kind of outside all of that, with the pretty extreme flooding in California and Texas a couple of years before that, and today the East Coast, specifically New York City. Wanted to really touch on the aspects and the needs technologically and commercially around expanding flood prevention mechanisms, specifically in the urban context. And to do so, I'm going to quickly run through kind of a general encapsulation of what the problem is, which is going to kind of include a definition of what we're talking about here in terms of flooding and the kind of aspects and types of flooding. Then going to dive into some of the more structural problems, starting first with infrastructure, moving on to the changing climate, increasing urbanization, and then generally tying that into the economic issues related to that, before moving on to kind of the solutions that can be applied to really understand, diagnose, and treat this issue at a high level, ranging from software to hardware to infrastructure developments, before kind of finally finishing off with a somewhat lengthy and extensive commercial outlook that really tries to drive home a couple take-home conclusions and key offerings from this podcast, which are going to focus on a way to view a new diagnosing of environmental issues that are not all solved with the let's say, from a Californian's perspective here, that are not always solved with just building more dams, since that seems to be the historic American interpretation of what to do with water and how to get more of it in a lot of cases. Dams are not going to be the answer here. Just going to lay that one out. But really trying to understand what the commercial environment looks like and who the key players are, kind of a key indication here I'm just going to set out now so we kind of have a structure to build off of it as we go, is that the major kind of client offerings here are going to be tailored towards governments, insurance providers, and there's going to be an interplay here on the provider side between kind of small startups and a larger conglomerate of infrastructure construction technology providers. Think AECOM, Jacobs, Raytheon, all of which I'll touch on again, and when to expect this kind of market to really develop, because as of today, September 30th, 2023, I've been kind of researching this at varying paces for now about, let's say, 7-8 months. And the market really hasn't gotten going in terms of any substantive VC investment. So this is going to be a much different, much more atypical coverage of kind of startup activity than the usual focus on VCs and rapid Series A expansions and very lucrative dealings with private equity. So kind of jumping into it from there, at a high level, just going to define the problem over the next couple minutes here. There's a real key differentiation that we need to understand, and this plays into our historic understanding of floods. So there's a couple different types of flooding. I'm going to focus mainly on two. There's another one to give consideration, which is much more coastal flooding, and I think coastal flooding deserves its own set of focuses and recognitions, but I think the ways to treat that specific area of flooding are more specific, and they deal with a lot more man-made infrastructure. There you're going to be dealing with artificial reefs, electrification, that's not the correct word, but the use of shock waves, basically, and magnetic, I believe, is their actually specific, not electric necessarily, but magnetic waves pushing against currents to kind of break up their energy, or utilizing the wave energy and renewable energy material. But coastal energy is its own total different, and flooding is its own total different section of this. So it's an issue, and one that can be harnessed in ways to make it a more productive part of society. It doesn't always have to be related to flooding. It can become a source of renewable energy, and maybe down the road we'll cover that. But I'm going to be focusing on the traditional versus the new aspects of flooding that are its most substantive sources in terms of commercial damages, liabilities, deaths, property damage, etc. So here, going to focus on those two types, one being pluvial meaning from rain, rainfall-based flooding, and the other being fluvial, or river overflow, basically. The key difference here being is most of our understanding of flooding over the last, especially in America, over the last, let's say, 125 to 150 years, somewhat biased because I am from the state of California, where, and specifically Sacramento and Elk Grove, but specifically Sacramento, who had a pretty terrible relationship with our river systems, and trying to prevent flooding, and constructing, let's use Sacramento as an example, actually. A really interesting relationship where our rivers would flood not in a super predictable manner, but in a very aggressive and severe manner. And when the kind of population began booming, this is a good metaphor for today, actually, as we'll touch on issues of urbanization. As the population began booming due to the gold rush in 1849 and then early 1850s, a massive swath of migration from Asia, mainly China, and across the U.S. coming in from the eastern seaboard and the Midwest, you kind of saw a swell in population in the Sacramento area, which includes a lot of different kind of areas. It's not just one, it's more of a metropolitan area growing into it these days, especially. My goodness, that city's growing. But trying to understand what the issues of urbanization entail and more dense population development. And this also goes into issues of kind of socioeconomic land use, almost in a way where oftentimes the more flood-prone areas are cheaper, and then into those areas move, obviously, people who don't have the resources to afford very high-end insurance policies or whatever. But so there are also socioeconomic implications here, but mainly focusing on the Sacramento example, continuing, severe floods come in, they wash out, hundreds of people, displace a lot of people, destroy properties. And the response, this was fluvial flooding, caused from snowmelt at very high rates, comes washing down, potentially also mixed in with some rainfall flooding, but mainly river-based. The rivers overflow, wash out on the banks, everybody pretty much who's in those areas. Pluvial flooding is much more focused on the idea of, take a city like New York. That's a great example. New York City. You go in, you urbanize the area exceptionally densely. The entire basic island of Manhattan now is covered in cement that's not very permeable to rainfall. So rain comes in, it collects on the surface. It doesn't really have anywhere to go. It eventually continues collecting. And because it has nowhere to go, it just stacks on top of each other. It begins flooding out buildings and streets and making things pretty much unnavigable. The sloping of various parts of the city makes sure it kind of condenses and condenses isn't really the right word, but collects in lower lying areas, making certain areas exceptionally uninhabitable while other areas are fine. So other issues come up there too in terms of infrastructure blockages. Think, piles of trash are left on the streets. They get swept into storm drains. Storm drains are meant to manage and distribute the water coming in from storms into, river channels or the ocean, whatever. Trash is blocked up in certain bottlenecks or transportation lanes. Think of it kind of like a highway system. If you have 6 semi-trucks in a kind of perpendicular manner to the flow of traffic, how are you going to get across a 12-lane highway even? So water begins accumulating and it rises, it floods out onto the streets, out of the storm drains. So that's the issue with pluvial flooding, is that infrastructure and the way we've developed cities, particularly in the Northern Hemisphere. I think there's a couple great examples to look at here, and we're going to touch on them. I think New York City, Boston, and London are great examples here that traditionally had to deal with more fluvial flooding, not all of these necessarily, but had to deal with more river-based flooding and develop, very interesting ways of coping with that, whether it be through spillways or not specifically these cities, spillways or diversion techniques or levees, like in Sacramento, for example. That's kind of what they're famous for. But pluvial flooding is increasing for very specific reasons. So kind of getting into what the numbers here say, there is going to be an expected 26.4 increase in U.S. flood risk by 2050. And this is mainly going to focus on a lot of U.S. metrics just because that's what I have access to and it's the most referenceable data points. But globally, I'm just going to say this initially, globally, East Asia is actually the most susceptible to flooding. And it's a much more different metric there because the population is also very urbanized, but it's a bit more, the metrics are a bit different. So the risks of flooding there are actually higher in terms of the number of people exposed and the percentages of people exposed actually. But again, I'm going to focus mostly on the US here because it's just the more digestible data for me. But again, that's a whole area to analyze. And globally, actually, the highest people at risk of flooding and death from flooding and exposure to flooding are actually the poorest people in the world, which is fascinating to think about. There's a couple of reasons for that. But continuing on, current annual losses from flooding per year are rated at $32.1 billion a year. The current U.S. population exposed to flood danger annually is 3.63 million people a year. By 2050, this is expected to grow 97.3% to 7.16 million people a year due to various things that we've already touched on, but also including something we're going to touch on in a little bit, the climactic kind of effects and the changing of rainfall and precipitation patterns and also soil, actually. As things become more arid and drier in certain seasons, a lot more, mainly towards, I'd say, the western part of the U.S., but drier soils can't handle water as well as moisture soils. So continuing on here, where this is going to be concentrated in is high population areas with increasing urban density. Another area that we're going to touch on and kind of another reason for the increases in flood danger in America, infrastructure decay and population growth, really going to be concentrated in Florida with a population exposure of just over 500,000 people, California with 345,000 people, New York with just under 250,000 people at 247,000 people, and Texas with, again, also just under 250,000 people exposed to flooding. Disproportionately, though, these effects are really focused on areas that aren't traditionally considered, major environmental disaster areas. Think West Virginia, Vermont, and Louisiana. Louisiana is a bit different. They have a exceptionally high tendency for environmental disaster. There's a couple reasons there, including but not limited to, in my opinion, some government mismanagement pretty frequently. But again, those are some spillways. Florida also exceptionally high proportion of environmentally affected people, let's say. That's a kind of an interesting term there, environmentally affected people. And all of this data is coming from Oliver E.J. Wing and some of his associates researching at the University of Bristol, as well as William Lehman at the Hydrological Engineering Center from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in Davis, California, another area with pretty extensive knowledge of flooding. And again, not too far from hometown of Sacramento there, 20 minutes. I was actually supposed to go to UC Davis, so I always have a soft spot for UC Davis. And Davis in general, great city. So kind of getting into why we're facing this. I've already touched on a lot of these areas, but to continue on, the development of American cities specifically have come at such a pace, and especially in relation when you map it to global climatic shifts, they were really developed at a time where the global climate wasn't changing at too high of a pace. Think the late 1700s, early to mid 1800s. That's when a lot of American cities first began to grow. San Francisco was obviously founded and really began developing around the gold rush. Los Angeles really began a major expansion, and they haven't had exceptionally difficult issues with flooding, but some. Los Angeles really began developing, in my opinion, a conversion from their kind of agricultural areas over to more of an urbanized population sometime around late 1800s, early 1900s. So as kind of the onset of major global climatic shifts is occurring, U.S. cities have been built in a manner that hasn't really been informed by those decisions. Not to say that there's a ton of new cities being developed now, but maybe the infrastructure was set down in a way that had no clear and obvious understanding of what was going on. And I think we're going to get into this right now, being that the vast majority of water piping in the U.S. was installed in the early 20th century or mid 20th century. And basically the effect of water piping is to deal with water management. So this ranges from stormwater to household water management. And the focus here was on cast or ductile iron piping, which was expected to provide 50 to 100 years of trouble-free service. The issue being with these pipes is they're highly susceptible to corrosion and breakage. The average lifetime expectancy is 50 to 100 years. And when you think about averages, having that wide of an average is something, 50 to 100 years is quite the quite the interesting length of time. It could either, last its expected lifetime of 50 or double that. Very interesting. But the issue here comes from a lack of investment in the infrastructure health of the United States. So the average age of water piping in the country is 45 years old, meaning we're just at an average 5 years away from reaching this kind of threshold for when pipes really need to be examined and put under pretty substantial, consideration for replacement. And it's coming at a time where a lot of water systems are already failing. And what you're seeing actually is that a lot of metropolitan water systems are actually in worse health than their suburban or rural counterparts. This isn't entirely true. I think in the Midwest and Southeast, especially in some rural areas, you have pretty strong difficulties with water management from time to time. This is also true in California, especially when you look at our major floods. A lot of them are concentrated actually in spill zones. Think like most of you probably won't understand this, but Wilton, just outside Sacramento, very rural, very agricultural area, doesn't have the same investment. But when you kind of look at what I said earlier in the metropolitan focus of a lot of water health, a lot of the piping in New York City, for example, is over 100 years old already. So there's massive failures already occurring in the city. And there's a metric, I believe it's 700 approximate breaks a day in water lines or water piping was the number. I don't have that in front of me at the moment, but approximately 700 breaks in water pipes a day. And a lot of those are concentrated in urban areas. So when we talk about what it's going to look like to start replacing this at a national scale, and for timeline clarification, this is really going to start ramping up from 2035 to 2050. This is going to be a timeline we keep referencing back to. By 2035, the average age will be around, assuming a natural progression, let's say 47 to 48 to approaching that 50 number. But just assuming everything is at an average, most of the water piping in the country being 45, by 2035, that is 12 years from now, you're going to have that main group of piping at 57 about. Obviously, that's not exactly how medians and means work, but kind of thinking there, 60-year-old piping, there's going to need to be per year 16 to 20,000 miles of pipes replaced. This is coming from the US EPA. And they're going to peak in 2035 in terms of pipe replacements per year. This is 4 times the annual rate of current pipe replacements. Current pipe replacements right now are 4,000 to 5,000 miles a year. And this is going to project in terms of cost, in terms of replacing and monitoring these newly replaced pipes, at approximately $839 million a year. So something I want to touch on right now before moving on is that in metrics released through a couple different startups and a couple different environmental agencies, US and European, the rate of investment to benefit, so cost reduction, think liability and harm reduction, lives lost, property damage, etc. Effective investment in prevention instead of response is 5 times more effective. So 5 times more lives saved, 5 times more property damage reduction, 5 times more general benefit if you're proactively preventing flooding versus reacting to it. And there's also a couple different metrics, and they vary here, but usually in terms of intense or metropolitan flooding, the average anticipation is around 4 hours, which is not nearly enough time to deal with it. So we're going to now get into kind of trying to understand how you can anticipate flooding. And I think part of that comes from understanding the climate and the urbanization factors. So as the global temperature continues to rise, this isn't, again, we live in an interesting political setting right now, especially in America, where this is debated very frequently. And debate's not a bad thing, but especially if you come from somewhere like I do in Sacramento, where I remember summers being a high of 95 or so when I was 5 or 6, to now having summers with highs of 111, 114. And again, personal anecdotes aren't always the best reference, but just my opinion based on my own experiences. As global temperatures continue to increase, more evaporation occurs from oceans and water streams, lakes, rivers, and then this in turn increases overall precipitation as it falls back to Earth. So we have more water in the water. What was that called in elementary school? The water cycle, something like that. Evaporation, condensation, precipitation, etc. But importantly, to kind of layer into this, since 1901, global precipitation has increased at 0.04 inches per decade. Interestingly enough, the same rate in the US, so global precipitation per year, has increased 5 times the global average, so 0.2 inches per decade. Layering that up, it may not seem like a lot, but when you consider the variations, especially in terms of the climates in America, we have vast deserts and kind of low-lying marshes. We have a ton of different climatic variation, especially when you consider half of the country really from, I believe it's the 40, what's the parallel? Whatever the parallel just beyond, or like in the middle of Texas is, where a lot more of the country is arid than not. Maybe that's not, well, a lot of the country is arid. When you consider all these things, 0.2 inches per decade, you stack that up over, multiple decades here, it's kind of a scary feat there. So considering that, and then when you also consider increased flooding events in historically non-problematic areas, think of Sacramento and San Diego, just in the California area, San Francisco, think about that. It's probably escaped now the national memory, but San Francisco had flooding that I've never seen before. I went to university in the Bay Area for 4 years, and my home institution of Berkeley had like rivers flowing down the damn streets. Never seen anything like that. But continuing on here, there's a misconception that you can't have drought and flood and have climate change. So they're linked, actually. They're not mutually exclusive. So a warmer atmosphere actually increases the rate at which water evaporates during the drier periods of the year. So meaning that the atmosphere holds more water vapor. This is why actually you're feeling a bit more, some people actually have reported feeling a bit more of the humidity in areas of California, traditionally more arid environment, which is very interesting, and I can actually quite relate to that. This in turn fuels heavy rainfall when rain is a larger event, or when rain does come, let's say. And parched soils, so the drier soils, actually can't really absorb the water at an effective rate, which leads to very high intensity flash flooding. You see this a lot in like Utah, for example, which is has a specific type of soil, sure, that really does not absorb moisture. But soil types, so if you have a very wet soil and wet grass and naturally occurring root systems, as opposed to kind of a very arid, cracked, dry soil type that can't really filter water. The water just kind of comes and sits. The natural ability of soil has kind of been depleted in those drier soils. They don't have the ecosystem existing from a flora point of view, the plant structures to really absorb that water through roots and soil content. It's all dried out and gone. So the water actually ends up taking sediment with it or just flowing right off the top. So what is important to understand is that the two don't have to be mutually exclusive. They're linked, actually, and they're dangerously linked. So the more drought you have, the more dangerous flooding you have. And while this episode is focused more on urban flooding, this is a really big issue for kind of rural flooding, especially in instances too, like wildfire, where something comes in and burns through all the local vegetation. You have root systems that are very vulnerable and exposed. And if water can seep in and just sweep away, you get massive mudslides and landslides and really destroyed environments. So this is just something to really consider. And especially now as we move back into the urban perspective, you're seeing increased urbanization with 55% of people today living in cities. By 2050, expected to be 68% or more of people. This is, something that really needs to be touched on as a major issue here, is that high density doesn't necessarily protect you. You would think the massive amounts of funding that come in would create these, Eden-like situations of environmental harmony. But when you look at areas like Houston or New York City or San Francisco that have recently encountered these massive issues of urban water management, it's just not accurate. And we're just not prepared. These are issues that politicians and city planners have never really been approached with because, like I said, take a city like San Francisco that was really only developed into a major metropolitan city. The city wasn't even called San Francisco. It was what was the city? Buena something, I believe, or Yerba something. Yerba Buena, maybe? I actually believe it was called. But you take these cities, I believe it was Yerba Buena. Now I'm curious. Yeah, Yerba Buena. Look at that. That's what a history degree from UC Berkeley gets you. Yerba Buena. So eventually becoming San Francisco. Never had any real substantive issue of urban flooding and wasn't urbanized, but hadn't really had issues of substantive pluvial flooding. And then, the massive increases in precipitation that California experiences in very short bursts now due to climate change and are causing these very strange interactions. And you look at cities like Houston, like I said earlier, or New York City, it's not something we're really prepared for. So kind of moving on through here, just a couple more metrics that I really want to touch on that I feel like are important. Another issue with flooding is potentially damaging waste collection and sorting in urban areas. So, if water is able to penetrate, after flooding the city level or even through cracked pipes, able to penetrate into, waste streams, and think of how we, manage waste in this country, and able to just kind of spread that throughout a city, you get, very disgusting sections of your imagination. And, this also spreads to rural areas with eutrophication, fertilizers that have just been sprayed. A massive flood comes down and wipes all of that into water streams, potentially poisoning fish and people. Something to really consider. So another issue here to consider is that, insurance companies, nobody really has too much sympathy for them. But when you think about their role in the American economy, it's very interesting to consider kind of what we're dealing with here. So there's an estimated total for flood damages worldwide since 1980. That number is $1 trillion. Only 12% of that $1 trillion in the last 43 years was insured. What that tells me is insurance companies haven't known how to deal with these type of floods for quite a while. That and also access to insurance. I think that remains a big issue. But within that number, that 1 trillion, 850 billion of these damages have occurred since 2000. So in a 43-year period, taking the back 23 years of that, let's say about 50%, 85% of all damages have occurred in the last 23 years. So that tells me that this is getting really bad really quickly. So let's talk about ways to solve this issue of pluvial flooding in urban environments. So the climate is going to keep changing in ways that we can't necessarily control. We can, cut emissions, reduce emissions, pursue other ways with, cleaner burning fuels, etc., to really try to preserve this climate that we're in and allow it to kind of self-medicate in a way. Nature will figure itself out. That's not precisely the right word I would use, but what we can control is how we interact with our infrastructure and develop our infrastructure. So a lot of the technology in this space is focused at the software level, and it's going to be very focused on, I would say, two major themes, one of them being machine learning and the other one being computer vision. And I'll apply them in different ways, but at a high level, it's a focus on advanced modeling and the fusing of local studies on climate conditions and topographical patterns and urban water management systems. So taking and accumulating and aggregating all of the data that you have to manage water and predict how water will interact with your urban environment, and merging that into a comprehensive understanding of the local environment that the water will be entering. Once you have that information and you can, play with it and deal with it, once you have that information focusing on the localized specific climate patterns, the infrastructure that it's entering, and we're going to touch on kind of how exactly that's done, but once you have the site-specific locations and the variations topographically, etc., you can funnel that into larger data sets, focus on climatic data, utilizing really refined present, past, and future impacts, tracing sea level rise, tropical cyclones, changing weather patterns at a national, state, regional, city, township, hamlet scale. And maybe the hamlet is a little exaggerated, but very localized up to national weather patterns. And then the idea being that you can chart this alongside those really localized data sets, including the high quality local flood mapping and flood bank predictions, information from local experts and historic experts perhaps, as well as real-time observation of flood events, past, present, and future. So the idea here is to create almost an artificial, what would be the term, clone of the real-time infrastructure and kind of how it's functioning. And one way you can do this, touching on the hardware aspect, is through the use of sensors. Mainly here you're focusing on flow gauges. So the idea that you point oftentimes a laser at a specific sewer or water pipe and the water rushing through it. And you can kind of calculate, I believe it's often based on water pressure. So parts, or what is it, pressure per inch, or whatever the metric is, and calculate how quickly water is flushing through there. And using that, you can detect if new streams of water are entering the channel, if it's due to blockages at another water piping or sewer line, causing things to divert or things to increase in terms of rushing. And that really gives you real-time forecasting. But very importantly is there need to be digital models and creations, not only in terms of viewing things, but also in terms of understanding how flooding will impact these cities. So creating models and algorithms that can detect if X conditions occur in the city of Boston, perhaps in this one particular borough or neighborhood or whatever they call them in Boston. I'm going to be honest here. I haven't spent much time in Boston. The food is lovely, but I'm not particularly familiar with the local understandings of neighborhoods. So being able to say if X amount of water enters due to pluvial flooding from rain, we get 10 inches in a week. What is going to happen? What are the predicted blockages to occur? What are the likelihoods that certain infrastructure fails, certain pipes fail? There need to be ways to predict this and to consciously monitor infrastructure health. One way to do this is with a leading startup focusing on computer vision and identifying storm drain and sewer cracks and breaks and leakages. And the idea here being that you can take a repair, what the costs associated with a repair crew are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of dollars a day, and lower that down. All you need is a camera and some type of propulsion device. I can't remember exactly what it was tied to when I talked to these people, but the guys over at Sewer AI, utilizing a camera and propelling it down various types of infrastructure, whether it be a storm drain or some other type of piping. Take the data. They have some type of lighting mechanism, I assume, as well attached, and they take the data, they run it through proprietary algorithms to detect those cracks, those breakages, and those leaks using computer vision. So matching it to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of data sets of what a crack looks like. And then you can automize that specific recognition part of it. You don't need a human to do it anymore, and you can really isolate and expedite the amount of time that it takes to repair those things, while also theoretically being able to develop a digital infrastructure, which is where kind of a clarity and subsurface mapping comes in. And that's where you can kind of focus on a company like Civil Grid, another startup, but their focus is on creating massive subsurface understandings of kind of the areas in which we work and in which construction is done. They're focused predominantly in California with partnerships like PG&E, I believe. And they're creating kind of these whole maps of digital urban areas, but all under the ground, and understanding kind of where things are hidden. And I think a partnership of the two, Sewer AI and Civil Grid, could really be effective in understanding and modeling, not just at a algorithm level where you can get a 0 or a 1, kind of a binary answer of flooding or no flooding, 70% risk versus 30% risk, but an understanding of where specifically infrastructure spending needs to happen. And not to say this isn't already being done through companies that we'll discover and touch on in a bit, like Pervisico and Fathom, who are really leading the line in terms of understanding flood risk, but kind of through more of an insurance bent, but also understanding where it's going to occur through the use of sensors overlaid with software. But at a whole, I would say the software component is very much focused on understanding and predicting risk, or mapping that risk. So a company like Civil Grid as well, although they don't focus exclusively on flooding, has also really interesting environmental maps they've created as well to kind of layer into things. And this includes flood-prone areas, areas of high erosion, or areas with chemical leaching, I believe was also one of them. Various environmental metrics to kind of layer in there. But this speaks to a need for kind of a greater clarity and transparency in terms of what we're really dealing with on an infrastructure level. There need to be digital mappings occurring. So moving through that, you also have what I described earlier is the focus on sensor technology now and partnering that with software services, feeding immense amount of data to create these very granular understandings of what water flow should and shouldn't look like, what problems are and aren't, and being able to correlate that with kind of the development of predictive algorithms to understand when and how floods will occur. Another very exciting feature when you pair the hardware with the software elements is that you can take the occurrence of a natural disaster in somewhere like, say, New York, and apply it into Boston in certain kind of ways. You can start understanding, what their key problem areas were, or if you have that disaster happen, say the current floods in New York, say you use that data, if you've collected it, 30 years down the line, you kind of have models now for very usable models now on an exact city level scale for the next 30 years, however long this current climatic shift occurs. Who knows, maybe we'll be in the ice age in a couple decades here. But yeah, the idea of being able to partner sensor technology with these software services to develop much more refined and granular understandings of how our infrastructure is kind of dealing or can deal with these things. And kind of finally at a infrastructure, kind of that hard level understanding, there needs to be a focus on rebuilding our cities and renovating them in a way that's much more, how would you say, able to deal with water. Not every city has slopes that can deal with high water and accumulation. And even cities like Seattle, for example, who does have quite frequent rain, they don't really deal with flooding all too often. You would have thought that somewhere like San Francisco would have been able to deal with kind of their flooding issues a little bit more gracefully, but it's not all just about hills. So really focusing in on the pavement and the textures provided. So certain pavements are able to allow water through them in a bit more of a pacey way, let's say. The important part here being that you don't want the pavement to be the limiting factor. You want the actual ecology and subsurface environment to be the dictating factor. The naturally occurring water systems within the ground are very easy to kind of manipulate and weaponize in a way to deal with water. So if you just allow concrete to be permeable enough for water to pass majority of it through, there's certain issues surrounding water penetration in certain types of concrete. But if you allow the water to permeate through the concrete at a high level, allow kind of the ecosystem below to kind of disperse and deal with it as it may need to. San Francisco may be a specific example of where this could go wrong. I'm not entirely sure of this, but I know a lot of the areas have been reclaimed to varying extents and artificially manipulated, like kind of Amsterdam and the kind of whole of the Netherlands, not Holland, but the Netherlands, those northern areas that were reclaimed from kind of more watery, marshy areas were. Not entirely sure of the applicability there, but in areas with very unpermeable pavement, like Boston and New York, a lot could be achieved with better, surface level manipulation of the water through concrete systems. There's a company called Pave Drain who actually provide pavement solutions that are highly permeable and actually have a sensor technologies embedded underneath them to track kind of the water flow and diversion rates. But again, the idea is that you can weaponize Mother Earth in a lot of ways to naturally deal with water as they would have 100, 50, 25, 300 years ago, the same exact way. The water systems exist. You just need to allow those ecosystems to take care of themselves and work with them. The idea is you're blending into the ecology, not trying to stand out as a human-oriented kind of Anthropocene defining trait that we sometimes have, managing our cities in a much more intelligent ways. And this ranges from those pavement textures that I mentioned earlier, paved drain being one of them, and even the concrete composition that makes a very specific benefit. So that's going to be the main focus on the types of solutions we're seeing here. Again, a lot of it is going to focus on the interplay between software and hardware and really forming very, very comprehensive understanding and granular levels of understanding for city to city. So we're going to really start on specific neighborhoods in New York and Boston and London. And then from there, you start building out city level maps, understanding how much water can the whole city of London handle from this pluvial barrage. Say, I'm going to make a prediction here in April of 2024. Hopefully not, but say April 2024, pluvial barrage hits all of these areas. And you need to have very comprehensive mappings done and very comprehensive predictions and working algorithms that can predict the amount of water that can be handled and also understand very specific granular, I keep saying granular, but it's really the best word for this type of thing, meaning very specific, very minute, very comprehensive understandings of a singular maybe pipe. Say, the exit pipe from a specific neighborhood into the Thames River, and in London, I believe it is. Say, I don't know, Tottenham or something. I don't know. But all the rain that gets poured into Tottenham, how is this specific pipe going to help or make an issue of that drainage? What are the annual levels of blockages that occur and how severe are these usually? There needs to be a much more refined understanding of how we can deal with water because the precipitation is going to continue. We need to develop more comprehensive understandings through software and assisted learning models, really focusing on that machine learning, using data sets that we can collect over years and years and years. We just need to start now with collecting that data in terms of how our infrastructure is functioning. And then the infrastructure side, really just focusing on that idea earlier that I mentioned, that our piping system is really faulty. And if you really want to make infrastructure improvements, you're going to need to utilize new technologies on the software side to really expedite that repiping procedure I was talking about earlier. And that estimate I said was probably not with the technologies that are arising from people like Civil Grid and Sewer AI when I said that the annual rate of replacement and monitoring is going to be $839 million a year from the Environmental Protection Agency for that 16 to 20,000 miles of pipes replaced per year. You can really expedite that with very comprehensive understandings of which pipes need to be replaced when and how to do so. And the manual labor of it probably won't change very much in terms of its automation or its efficiency, but the detection of it really could. And that's the important part, is detecting the issues before they arise. Prevention, like I said earlier, is 5 times more effective in mitigating, preventing death, harm, property damage, insurance liability than any form of response. Response is not the answer. We have very comprehensive and continuously developing understandings of how climate will be changing and what that means for our dealings with various aspects of it, focusing specifically on the water cycle. The idea is being able to evaluate those and how they play in with our built environment. So now kind of moving on from the innovation side onto the commercial outlook for each of these. The interesting thing, like I said, where there's not going to be a ton of new innovations in terms of automating the replacement of infrastructure. These are what you can kind of consider as high cost, low innovation sectors. Substantive but intangible benefit, but not necessarily anything going to be jumping out of the woodwork in terms of, seeing Burnt Island Ventures or whoever pumping, $100 million into a startup. Probably not the most realistic unless it's able to generate some type of renewable energy. And I think there you're more focused on marine energy, really focusing on that like electromagnetic pulsing of waves and then kind of accumulating some type of energy from that. But that's not where we're focused. So we're going to see a lot of movement here, and it kind of makes sense for something that's high cost but low innovation. You need something that's proven. Or in major cities. So think Milwaukee, for example, is really zeroed in on improving its ability to handle increased water capacity and prevent flooding in its low-lying areas. I believe Pave Drain has actually done some work there. So you're going to see a lot of that. The proven technologies, the infrastructures, the new concrete mixtures and porous pavements that are able to kind of interplay with the ecology a bit more are going to be much more pursued on the public side. On the other side, software and sensor technologies are going to be much more fragmented and regionalized. You have kind of actually a lot of innovation coming from the UK. This is partially due to a $6.6 billion investment in July of 2020 from the the United Kingdom kind of flood response. I don't know the specific organization that authorized this. I assumed it came from a bill passage or something. But a massive investment of $6.6 billion in understanding both infrastructure subsurface and understanding flooding causes and kind of the interplay between the two. How can infrastructure be used to combat flooding, and how can flooding be used to understand infrastructure's limitations? So massive investment there. And I think what you're seeing as a result is two major flooding startups or flooding technology startups, Previsico and Fathom, both of which are kind of leading the line in a lot of ways in terms of the research and understandings in digital modeling and mapping and algorithm use and flood technology and flood prevention coming out of the UK because of this. You also have some players from Scandinavia and the US, but I would say Fathom and Previsico are really kind of leading the line in terms of aggressive partnership building with insurance companies specifically. France is also kind of engaging with a similar amount of investment in terms of flooding, but kind of the model here is really kind of providing a software as a service model, so selling on that detection, the mapping, the preparation services to insurance companies. And they're usually actually, a lot of these companies are developed alongside an insurance company. They kind of have a partnership right out of the go. So even without ever contacting, sending a dry, cold email, whatever it is, they have a kind of guaranteed customer because they've developed their product alongside an insurance company since their inception. Previsico is a great example of that. Oftentimes, these companies also sell on a sensor, or they can just sell the sensor outright to a government trying to handle things in-house, but partnering those sensors with a software as a service model not only offer the company a more comprehensive analysis of what's going on and data to kind of feed into their larger models, but also offer the kind of government or whoever's subcontracting out kind of a more, what would the word be? A more healthy interplay between hardware and software within their kind of ecosystem. I'm trying to remember the word for that, but very healthy, very quick, very expeditious kind of connection between the sensor technology and the software as a service mapping. Again, kind of focusing on the development side of this, Previsico is interesting because they're pretty rapidly expanding in North America, but they've started with a real focus in England. And kind of no matter how they approach this, they're going to have to take it at a very slow pace, kind of building neighborhood by neighborhood, region by region, until they can develop these larger comprehensive mapping systems. But even then, really just to be able to understand the subsurface infrastructure of Boston or London or New York City is a massive feat with the amount of millions upon millions upon millions of people living in those cities and the millions of dollars invested in the subsurface infrastructure and the millions more that's going to need to be put into that. So really going to be expanded slowly and kind of creating a mosaic of coverage. And where you could really see some interplay now, I think, as these kind of start coming through, especially today, I think you're actually seeing a lot more development nowadays, is with a company like Raytheon or AECOM or Jacobs or Munich RE, these insurance or construction or infrastructure or general tech companies. I think a real interesting play from a group like Palantir or Raytheon could be to come in and buy a couple of these flood kind of technology companies and really merge their models to create, a hub for all of the Northeast, all of the New England area, all of California, something like that. I think you're going to really see a partnership or acquisition or just general kind of not theft of technology, but let's say mirrored technology. Additionally, you're going to continue seeing public investment. I think a great example here is $17 billion in loans from the EPA through the WIFIA. that are really focused on developing new flood management and water management systems, mainly in the American kind of southeast, I would say, and maybe deep south, areas that traditionally lack that type of investment. And I also think there's an interesting kind of private-public partnership going on here that's a little bit more conventional maybe in the UK. You have dealings between, I believe it was AECOM and the UK government to kind of create some mapping technologies, but NOAA, which is a focused on water management and atmospheric science, awarding an $80 million 4-year contract to Raytheon to develop national water prediction tools. So flood management, how that impacts rural, urban, suburban kind of inhabitants, and also the properties they have. So you're seeing kind of two interesting trends here: a corporate participation and a public participation, and mixing between the two too. Not always involved in startups. Sometimes they just go right over the head of startups. Very interesting. But one thing you're not seeing is a lot of VC investments, just because the returns are going to be pretty limited. Outside of insurance-facing tools, I think there's a couple companies you can really make a mention of or an argument for that have kind of bucked this trend. I think Civil Grid and Sewer AI, but they're not really in flood mapping. They're much more in kind of digital mapping or infrastructure faulty detection type industries. They're not really trying to predict flooding. So you're going to be really relying on government contracts for a lot of infrastructure evaluation and a lot of kind of the who is going to purchase flood mapping tools. So something to bear in mind, not a heavy VC focused industry. So at a very high level, what I hope you've kind of taken away as we wrap this up is that there's going to be rapid growth in the software as a service offerings and kind of the regionality of those, and eventually I believe either acquisitions of those companies or incorporations or partnerships or larger kind of companies kind of coming in and modeling using the same technologies to inform governments. And the big player here, I didn't really mention them too much, is insurance providers. Thinking about how Previsico molded their whole product to fit insurance needs. And when you think about things like a lot of insurance companies pulling out of the California homeowners insurance market entirely due to risk. Insurance is an interesting kind of play here, and especially in the climate disaster market generally, insurance has a very interesting role to play. So looking at that, really trying to emphasize the role of insurance providers and how to cope with flooding and prevent damages, and kind of how to evaluate rates and premiums. They have a huge vested interest in this technology, and I think you're actually going to see a lot of participation and kind of customer engagement there. So something to really focus on. And I think the other kind of area that I really want to touch on is that this market is going to continue kind of developing on a technological point. I think the commercial expansion really takes place between that 2027 to 2035 range, where you can really start expecting some really aggressive partnership strategies, either between startups and corporations, startups and city governments, state governments, contract awards in that range, kind of like I'm going back to earlier. There's going to need to be a peaking of those pipe replacements. And I think that this is really what it comes down to. A lot of it is finding ways to intelligently redevelop infrastructure. And that's both a pace and an efficiency perspective and a severity perspective. So being able to handle massive increases in the amount of water you're dealing with. Because right now, New Yorkers are losing cars. In New Year's, I was actually at a big festival, New Year's of 2022 going to 2023. And it was in San Bernardino, California, particularly arid part of California, not, desert yet, but particularly arid. And it rained that night. And, we were all, a little confused, and it's like, oh, that's not too bad. Until we saw the porta potties start flooding. And then we walked back to where we parked our car, and we saw cars underwater. This is not normal. And whether it's going to continue or not, all indications are that it's going to continue and worsen. So finding ways to manage cities in a more intelligent way, and bearing in mind that, in 2035, the projection is that current rates of construction on subsurface infrastructure, on that piping, are going to grow 4 to 5 times. So Think about when you walk down New York City and it's just scaffolding, just, all those people under the ground kind of digging things up. Just imagine all the construction, imagine that 4 to 5 times greater. So really focusing on the boom that's coming here, and developing those technologies early now for infrastructure replacement and enhancement, but also mapping. I think that's the other. So you have the infrastructure perspective, and you also have the mapping and the modeling perspective, and both really need to interplay effectively. And I think that there's also a lot of room for kind of that Venn diagram idea of maybe there's solutions we haven't even thought of yet. So leaving you with that, again, it's been a very interesting topic, and one that's, kind of increasingly a humanistic topic, I suppose. Everybody's dealing with this. There's a purported, I believe it's 1.8 million people exposed to flood risk every year. So increasingly human-centered topic, and something that I really found very interesting and have a lot of hope for. So this has been Parker Bovée of the A podcast, that being an E with an acute accent. Really appreciate you tuning in and hearing out some of these ideas on flood prevention and technology, and how to reduce kind of the what's appearing now a very Atlantis-y, a scary fate for urban flooding. So yeah, I really appreciated it. Hope you have a great rest of your day.